Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Power of Internal API Programs webinar. And we have today Chris Swansea, who's with me to do this webinar. Chris, why don't you introduce yourself and give some background?
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Swansea, and I'm with the product management team here at Apigee. In my recent prior life, I was involved with our customer success organization, which is the consulting group for Apigee. And so I've been involved with a lot of pretty detailed customer implementations, have done a lot of API program planning and implementation and so on. So I'm super excited to be here.
Thank you. And my name is Bala. I work in the Apigee product team as well. And I've been with Apigee for a couple of years and trying to help build the best product for our customers here. So with that, some basic housekeeping. Let's just go through some of the things we want to talk about. One, if you have been listening to a lot of our webinars, you're probably familiar. We do have a YouTube channel. Would request you guys to go check it out and subscribe if that's something you would wish to do, so that you get updated anytime we post a webinar or some other content. The next thing is, of course, all these slides we've done so far in terms of webinars, as well as today's slides, will be posted up on SlideShare. So again, you can go and take a look at that and download it. As usual, all the content we do is Creative Commons, so feel free to download them, reuse them, share them as you may please. Last, we are very excited. We recently launched our community site. So we do have something called community.apigee.com, where you should be able to absolutely go and have great discussions with your peers and other users of Apigee products, as well as have a ton of content for specifically learning about Apigee products. So again, something you may want to do. With that, let's start with the webinar. So Chris, one of the things I always think about is, we always talk about API programs and people kind of relate API programs to platforms. But when it comes to API programs and platform, most of the people think about very specific external API programs. They think of companies like Twitter, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, people who have a large set of developers externally and they're building interesting things on top of their platform. So how should we think about APIs, platforms, and in this case, with respect to the nature of relationships on API programs per se?
As you said, there's a lot of people tend to think about API programs strictly in terms of the external perspective, if you will. But I guess you can generally classify the different types of API relationships or API programs based on kind of the nature of the relationship and the level of control versus curation that you have. So obviously on one end of that scale, you have API programs that are very tightly controlled, where there may be regulatory requirements and so on. And on the other end, you've got what we typically think of, which is a little bit more of a curation model, where an organization that's exposing an API has control over the API itself, but not necessarily the applications that use it and so on. So as you said, open adoption APIs like Twitter, Twilio, and so on tend to be very much focused on developer evangelism, bringing developers to the API, potentially generating revenue relationships with those developers, and so on. The interesting thing about open API adoption programs is that even though an organization that's exposing an API has a tremendous amount of control over the API itself, they really don't have a lot of control over how the applications actually use it. An open developer comes in, he registers, he gets approved, creates applications, and from that point he's really kind of working within his own business context and for his own business purposes. And obviously some of those purposes also generate revenue for the API program and for the organization, but in a lot of cases it's primarily for their own usage. So the next level down then in terms of control then would be a business partner relationship. This is a situation where there's a legal relationship, for example, or some very close business relationship between the organization that's exposing the API and the organizations that are actually using the API. And there's a little bit more control over how the API is used, just by virtue of the fact that you've got this closer relationship between the two organizations. But still, at the most fundamental level, the business partner is using the API for, primarily their own business purposes or for cooperative reasons. They're developing applications of their own that use this API. They've tied it into their own internal business systems, and so the organization that's exposing the API doesn't really have as much control over how it's actually being used. But there's at least a little bit more control there. So now we kind of cross into the realm of internally developed applications. So obviously here there's much more control. You as an organization are developing the applications yourself. You're working with a trusted media partner. You have a lot of control over how the brand is represented in the application, how the APIs are being used, and so on, right? And in fact, you may even have some additional things made available to you as an internal program that you wouldn't have if
Normally
you were an
for-
external.
Yeah, that's
Exactly.
right. Yeah.
So internal APIs, internal access to data, and so on and so forth. And that gives you a little bit of a competitive advantage, if you will, for your particular application. At the extreme end, then, you've got internal business systems that are perhaps implementing a SOA, service-oriented architecture, or they're working with applications that expose APIs, and they're tying these things together for their own business purposes. So in that case, obviously, there's a tremendous amount of control. Some of that control is internal, just through business processes and so on. But some of it could even be external control through regulation, business requirements, PCI constraints, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of how we tend to think about the different API relationships, if you will. And as you said, the external API program is generally comprised of open adoption APIs and business partner relationships. And the primary reason is because those things tend to be very externally focused.
Yes.
That is to say, I'm the owner of the API, I'm making this available to my partners and developers, you guys are consuming this thing, and it's very focused on kind of generating revenue, monetization, evangelism and outreach, and so on, even to some extent with business partner relationships, where you're developing that close business relationship for mutual benefit, right? In the case of internal applications, they kind of leak over into this external API program because there's still a lot of them that are very focused on external presentation, if you will. And so you can kind of consider them to be part of the external API program. They have some of the potential constraints in place with respect to rate limits and quotas and so on that you might impose on an external API program. But as I said, these applications tend to have access to facilities, data, or internal APIs that external applications don't really have. And so when you combine that with the need for service-oriented architecture APIs and some of the control and so on around that, that's where we really think this internal API program kind of falls into place. And you can really kind of think of the internal API program as being kind of a different way of thinking about APIs. You know, we've had this historical bias toward external programs that are very externally focused, but at the same time, we have some great opportunities to really think deeply about how we want to use internal APIs and what it means to us, both from an internally developed application perspective and also from an internal business system perspective. And if we really kind of think about those things, then we can develop some potential competitive advantages. We can change the way that we use APIs and how we invoke services and so on, and we can really kind of save ourselves a lot of time and challenges, as well as giving ourselves some additional flexibility in how we use them.
Got it. So I'm sure we're going to get into more details on this one. So the one thing that jumps out for me from the slide is, though, when you look at the control part of it, is it fair to say that we should not confuse or assume that control is all about governance? Because that's something which enterprises are used to.
Right.
And in the API context, we don't believe governance and control are the same things. Is that a fair statement?
No, I think that's a very fair statement. Governance has a role in certain situations, but really when organizations tend to be more focused on rapid innovation, for example, and they want to be able to leverage some of the newer technologies and really kind of speed up their development, then governance becomes a bit of a challenge. And so we really start to think of things in terms of optimizing the development process, optimizing how we can innovate and continue to evolve applications and so on, and really kind of maintaining that competitive advantage that we might have and staying ahead of competitors and so on. So no, by no means does this control mean that we actually put a lot of governance in place and so on. It has a lot more to do with your ability to orchestrate systems in the back end and control the data that's being exchanged with applications that use the API.
Got it. So one thing I want to also ask you is that when it comes to external API programs, we in fact did a webinar I think a few weeks back, where we talked about how to think about API first architecture. When it comes to internal API programs, do we still want our customers and API program owners to think about it from an API first architecture, or do they have to think slightly differently or in a different fashion?
No, API first actually forms a really great foundation for thinking about API programs in general. Ed Aneth and Dushat Simons did a webinar a while back where they really drove in a lot of detail on API first, and they talked about this concept of paste layering and how different parts of an API program or different parts of applications and APIs tend to evolve at different rates and so on. So really, I think API first does have a lot of relevance regardless of whether we're talking about external or internal API programs. So you can see here that the API first architecture is really kind of broken down into two different perspectives on APIs. There's what we call the API consumption layer, which really deals with what we've kind of talked about in terms of external API programs, outwardly facing APIs, being enabled for rapid innovation, having security that's appropriate for outward facing APIs, and so on. You can contrast them with this notion of API exposure, which is a little bit more oriented toward internal API programs. That is to say, it deals a little bit more with how services from the business systems themselves are presented for consumption by APIs that actually make this available out to consumers of the API. And underlying API first is this notion of end-to-end analytics, so that you can really get super clear visibility into how APIs are performing, how your APIs are being used on the consumption layer as well as on the exposure layer. You can get tremendous metrics around latency and response time, error rates, and so on. And really, you can kind of build a good general overall picture of how APIs are being used in your organization. And that's got value in a ton of different places.
So with that, then let's dive in. So why don't we look at very specific things around what are the big areas of differences between internal and external API programs. So help us walk through this.
Absolutely. So one of the things that people typically think about with external API programs, and this is particularly true with open adoption APIs, is this notion of developer evangelism and outreach. Certainly, open adoption API programs have a need to be able to reach out to developers, to engage developers so that they use the API, they potentially generate revenue for the organization that exposes those APIs, and there's kind of this mutually beneficial ecosystem that develops around these things. Internal API programs are kind of interesting in this regard because depending on the nature of the organization, the nature of the API, there may or may not actually be a requirement for this level of evangelism.
Yeah.
You can say, for example, that in certain organizations where there's a very high level of close collaboration and so on, that people actually know and understand APIs and they're very willing to adopt them as part of their internal business processes and in applications that they use and so on. In other cases where you've got organizations that are a little bit more siloed or where you don't have this level of communication, it may actually be necessary to generate a little bit of evangelism, if you will, just to make sure that people are aware of what's possible with APIs.
So would it be also fair to say that when it comes to internal API programs, the evangelism could be in the form that IT typically tends to service a lot of organizations within an enterprise, and sometimes they just don't have the budget or scale to go and do that. And one way to think about this is that if they have an API program which different business units can consume very easily, they can come to a central place to understand what's available, and the APIs are documented very well, and it reduces the pain of IT having to really have more resources to address all those needs. Then they're empowering a lot of the business units to develop applications and do whatever they need to do for their business faster. And that's the way to think about it, evangelism, rather than pure play developer evangelism going out in the market.
Exactly. The real goal with internal evangelism is just to make sure that the different business units within the organization understand the facilities that are available to them so that they can leverage those in their organization. And just as we've continued to work with our own customers, we've seen tons of situations where people have put out just a little bit of work in terms of internal evangelism and had some tremendous rewards in API adoption.
So what about the actual developer support and resources? Because one thing I think about developers is that whether it's external or internal, I think developers really like to have good set of documentation. They would like to have sample code. They would like to have sample apps. Does that change for internal versus external?
The general concept doesn't really change. There's still a need for the documentation, for the test tools, for API consoles, for example, that allow people to experiment and so on. The place where there's a little bit of a difference between external and internal API programs is in the level of access. So for example, in an open API program or in an external API program, I would make that documentation available to all my business partners and other people that are consuming the API. But when I've got an internal program where I've got internal applications or services that are interacting by way of APIs, there's a need to kind of restrict that access to only those people that need to have it. This is particularly important in situations where you've got a DevOps model, for example, where individual teams are responsible for different aspects of the product. They want to have a certain amount of control over how APIs are being used and so on. And so there's a need for kind of this common mechanism for how we share documentation and give access both across individual teams and then even within within the general organization as well.
Yeah. Going on to monetization, so we know that as the external programs mature, people always talk about like how do we go and monetize our services and how is it easily done via APIs. But when it comes to internal, there's not really any option to monetize. So how should somebody think about that?
There's not quite as much emphasis on monetization, at least not in the form that we typically think of monetization. In a lot of cases, we tend to think of it in terms of rate cards where developers are paying for access, or there's some sort of a revenue sharing program or something along that line. In our particular case, or for internal API programs, the equivalent to monetization, if you will, is something like resource allocation or costing, cross-charging for resource usage, right? And that's particularly important, again, where you've got situations where the organization is somewhat siloed. People have individual budget for developing certain parts of the API. They're responsible, maybe in different IT organizations even, for implementing those APIs, making them available to the organization in general. And they do have an expectation that they're going to get some sort of return on that, or at least that it'll be a zero-sum balance when it comes to the amount of money they have to lay out versus benefit that the organization is getting from APIs in general.
So the last point I wanted to ask you a question about is design. So as you highlight here, there is design for specific use cases when it comes to external, because you want to be very, very prescriptive, or at least be applicable to certain use cases so that the external developers can take advantage. But when it comes to internal, you want a bit more latitude. You want people to go and play with it and understand what the API can do and do what they need to do with it.
Right.
So how should one think about the iteration of that? Because one of the things we've learned from multiple customers is there's no perfect API design out of the gate. You need to learn from your developers, understand what the pain points are, and keep improving. But the good news is it can be improved fast. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's a fair statement. I mean, there's been a ton of work in a number of different forums around just general best practices in API design. But when you think about external API programs versus internal programs, you really kind of draw a line between the needs of an external program, which tend to revolve more around rapid innovation and adapting the use of APIs to the needs of particular applications so that they can have an optimal user experience, right? In the internal API program, it's a little bit different. I mean, certainly you have a continued need for rapid innovation, but a little bit more of the focus is given to reusability and composability, where you can actually take different services and bring them together to accomplish a certain function, right? And so the design paradigm is a little bit different for internal APIs versus external APIs, but in both cases you have this need for very rapid innovation, and that's again where some of the technologies that we talked about, JSON and REST and so on, really come into focus.
Got it. Just to recap then, in terms of internal versus external, I think the focus today is going to be on internal. So what I'm hearing is that making sure that you have resources available for developers is still key. Because even though it's internal developers, you want to make sure that they have access to all the information so they can do interesting things with the APIs.
Absolutely.
The evangelism is, like one of our attendees pointed out, is less about push than creating a pull, so where people know that they can come to a place and have all this information and they can go and do interesting things for their business unit or their business goals. And also at the same time, we want to make sure that this is also cast in the lens of the fact that today IT is constrained. So they don't have the ability to go and stand up multiple systems for multiple business units. So how do you take advantage of all the resources you already have and give access via APIs to a bunch of business units who can then do interesting things? And the last one I heard from you is that the design iteration continues to be important because by nature, API design is never going to be perfect out of the gate. So whether it's for internal use or external use, we want customers to think about API design and iteration as part of their cycle when it comes to API programs.
Absolutely true. Regardless of how you're approaching APIs, this need for rapid innovation and flexibility in APIs is super important. And as you pointed out, things really never stand still. And so, as your application needs continue to evolve, as you move into new business areas or offer new products and so on, there's going to be a continuing need for innovation in APIs. You're going to need to change maybe the data that's returned so you can expose some new functionality, for example.
Yep.
Change the way that the APIs are actually presented so that you can look at the data in different ways. You can request it in certain ways that optimize the overall user experience. You may mash things together so
Yep.
that an application only has to make one API call to get the data that it needs. So there's lots of different dimensions to API design overall and to the evolution of APIs as you move forward.
We talked about API first architecture, so let's take that same frame of reference. And my first reaction would be that when we think about consumption and exposure, the way you laid out in the API first architecture, I would presume that API consumption is not as critical when it comes to internal API program. Would that be accurate, or am I missing something here?
Well, there actually is a dimension to the internal API program that has to do specifically with API consumption. The internal API program actually tends to span both into API consumption and API exposure. Specifically with API consumption, though, the things that you need to think about are, for example, how to integrate the various channels that you have with your customers into a single location so that you can really take advantage of all those different interactions. You can obtain data from those interactions. You can present a consistent user experience through a standardized API and standardized interaction mechanisms with these sites or applications. That's actually super important because it gives you not only some great opportunities to obtain data, but it allows the customer, the end user of your applications or your website, to have a really consistent user experience with respect to authentication and authorization and so on. Super critical. It's also really interesting from a consumption standpoint to think about ways that you can leverage what you already know about your API programs. Mm-hmm. This is particularly the case with situations where you do have all of these different interaction channels that kind of combine together through the API tier in the API first architecture, because then you have multiple different feeds that you can use to obtain information about your consumers. You can hopefully tie that into information that you get from external consumers of your API and build a good overall picture as to how users are using your system, what kinds of potential features they might like to see, what new business opportunities you have, and so on. And of course, you can tie that with some of the existing facilities that are available in the social realm, like
Yep.
Facebook and Twitter and so on and so forth. And of course, those give you a lot of really great additional information that, if your application is in the social realm or can really benefit from some of that information, there's a huge leap to be made.
And just to be clear, when you talk about social realm, we can also think about them in the enterprise context of things like Yammer or something else. So it does not have to be necessarily public-facing social. It can be enterprise employee-only social context as well.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. I think in any situation where you have people that are interacting with one another in some meaningful way, then you've got opportunities to be able to glean information or derive some level of benefit or guidance as to how people think about your system and your products.
Yep.
Right? Absolutely.
The aspect of bidirectional data sharing. We have a lot of customers who think about enterprise data as a fairly important, and they protect the resource. Mm-hmm. So how should they think about it, given that once you're inside the enterprise and you're creating something from a consumption point of view and you need to access the data from an enterprise data store point of view, the biggest worry or the biggest fear I've heard from customers is that if I give an access to that data store via an API, am I not risking a lot, because I may have everything from people maybe abusing it and things like that. So what is your kind of guidance from an internal API program consumption point of view, that how do they access that data in a very clean and a protected fashion?
Well, there's actually a couple different approaches you can use, and even on top of this notion of access is the nature of the data itself that's being shared.
Yes.
I mean, one of the things we've seen, for example, is that a lot of customers tend to implement APIs that just takes whatever the backend system gives them and pass it back to API consumers in a substantially unchanged fashion. And in some cases, particularly with internal applications, that's probably okay. But when you're dealing with business systems and interactions with external API consumers, for example, in particular, then the level of sharing that you take on is potentially problematic. And so as part of the internal API program, if you will, and in particular as we think about the interactions with back-end systems, it's important to really think about the level of data that's being shared, right? But even beyond the level of data itself or the nature of the data that's being shared, this notion of access is, there are things to be said for having purpose-built access mechanisms for data. There are certainly cases where it's appropriate to access data directly by way of services. Obviously, APIs provide a great way of doing that. But there's also mechanisms that you can use for relatively slow-growing or slow-moving data, stuff that doesn't get updated very much, and so on. Stored locations, for example, geo-related data, and so on. And this is actually a great opportunity for a back-end as a service type application, because you can take information that's been pulled from legacy systems, for example, or systems that are not necessarily accessible by way of API,
Correct.
and place that into a back-end as a service. You can mobile optimize it and really make it available in a way that makes complete sense for the applications that are using it, as opposed to the systems that actually generated it, right? So that's a super important consumption layer consideration. And then, of course, if you take that to the next level and tie it with data that comes in from the mobile applications, user profile information, for example, notification preferences and geolocation data, and so on, then you really have a great opportunity to kind of marry this data together and really get some significant benefit out of that.
Okay.
The other piece that's super interesting about this is this notion of state data or transient data, okay? In a lot of applications, particularly those that are fortunate enough to be in a situation where they're able to obtain information from multiple interaction channels, there's a huge amount of benefit in being able to take information that you get from one channel and kind of carry it through all the other applications. You know, for example, in the Apigee environment, we have this notion of access token attributes, and you can use that as a mechanism for allowing a user to log in, getting kind of an initial set of data about that user, and then as they continue to interact with various systems, you can kind of add on to that, change things around a little bit, and you can build an overall picture of how people are interacting with your API. And then you can turn right around in your applications and make that information available so that you can generate an even better user experience.
So I think that's a great segue into an example, right? So one of the things we want to talk about is a customer who's actually doing some of these things, so that we see how this is put into practice.
Yeah.
So one of the things, as you were talking through, for me, I kept reminding myself, is when you talk about users, they don't have to be necessarily consumers using the app. It could be your employees, your salespeople using that app, for example.
Right.
When you're talking about locations of the stores, it equally matters internally in terms of where the store is located and what the sales are from that store, as much as a consumer walking into the store because they found it on Google or some other search engine or on your app as they're looking for the nearest store and things like that.
Right.
So as we think through this, let's walk through this case study. This, of course, is a customer of ours who's into apparel and retail in a large way. It's a multinational. So give us a walkthrough on what exactly are they trying to do using an internal API program, and how does it correlate to what we just discussed in terms of consumption?
This is a great example of how API consumption can be influenced in the internal API program. Essentially, what this customer has done is put in place the API first architecture and the notion of an API tier that brings in data from all these different interaction channels. And so they have this really super rich base of information that they've gathered from all their different consumers, people that walk into the stores and buy things, people that buy things online, employees that have interactions with customers, and so on and so forth. And so they've stored all that data within their own business systems, and they've combined it with product data, and they've built a business to employee app so that when people walk into their stores, the employee can say, hi, I know that you've been here before. You've bought these things in the past. You might be interested in this new collection, information or collection that we have. I know that you have a certain color preference, for example, that you like. And so you're really able to generate this great personalized shopping experience for the customer. And even though it's the employee themselves that's actually using the application, the customer gets a massive benefit out of that, because they can walk in, they feel like they're really understood and known by the organization, and they're able to develop that super business relationship, even though it's kind of an offline channel, if you will.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So now we talked about consumption layer. We walked through the example of what it means from a consumption point of view. So let's go over the exposure side. So I was thinking this is where there's a lot of interesting stuff we could do when it comes to internal API program, which is going to be slightly different or very specific to internal API programs. So let's walk through what are the specific areas we want to think through differently when it comes to API exposure component.
Yeah, the API exposure layer is where the internal API program really has an opportunity to make some substantial benefits or bring some substantial benefits to the organization. Depending on how organizations have approached the implementation of services within their own business systems and so on, you may have a ton of different considerations you don't even know about. Organically grown applications and companies that have grown very rapidly may have point-to-point interactions, for example, that have been put in place just because they didn't want to take the time to build a cleaner level of integration. They may have challenges in terms of operational visibility because they don't necessarily understand the relationships between the various services and so on. So having an API exposure layer that allows you to tie these things together very nicely with an API contract that makes sense and gives you a certain centralized layer where you can get really not only operational visibility data and collate it together so that you know exactly how services are interacting, but you also have kind of a central point of application for auditing and so on. I actually just talked to one of our major financial customers yesterday, and they were talking about the fact that they've actually implemented this API first architecture and have an API tier and have found it to be a tremendous benefit for them because they now have a central point of auditing for all of their different interactions. And because of the fact that they're required to keep a lot of this information by federal regulations, if they had tried to do this without an API first architecture and an API tier, then they would have had to reach out to different systems and it would have been difficult for them to tie things together and so on. So they've actually found a substantial amount of benefit, even in just something as mundane as auditing.
Yes.
But even going beyond that, when you start thinking about resource accounting, if you start in particular business continuity and disaster recovery situations, really having a good understanding of how APIs interact and how services interact is super critical, because the last thing in the world you want to do is to get yourself in a situation where you've exposed an API, you've started to build some dependencies around that, but maybe nobody completely understands how these things work. And then suddenly you run into a situation where you have some sort of disaster and you need to go through a recovery exercise or fail over to an alternate site or something like that, and you suddenly discover, hey, I've got this new service that I never even realized I was using in this current application, and I've got this massive problem that I have to deal with, right? The other thing that's really interesting about looking at the API exposure layer and an internal API program is this notion of resource allocation and chargeback. And we'll talk a little bit about a use case where we specifically apply that, but so many organizations now, especially if they've got different business units, are really looking at ways to try and understand usage of underlying resources and so on, so they can make sure that they allocate those correctly and that they clearly understand how those resources are being allocated. Of course, strictly from an API design perspective, which we've kind of talked about a little bit here, the notion of having consistency in API contracts and a level of general understanding and synchronicity about how APIs are being used is really beneficial, particularly as a development tool. I mean, you and I have both done development type work or interacted with developers in the past, and we know that there's a lot of pain associated with trying to learn a new API or trying to figure out what payloads look like, and this API has this different data and so on. And so if you can have that level of synchronization that can be imposed by an API tier, then suddenly developers can walk into a new situation with a new API and have a good general sense as to how things already work. And that's super important from a flexibility standpoint. Versioning and deprecation has actually been a really interesting topic. We kind of dog food this ourselves, And we have an API that continues to evolve. We have new features and functionality and so on. And we're constantly struggling with this notion of versioning and how do we handle our API and so on. And a lot of our customers have expressed the same type of concern around versioning. This is particularly important when you have internal applications that really need to present that high user experience, and you've got internal exposure layer services that are really dependent on the capabilities of certain versions of a particular API. If you change the underlying API, suddenly you've got this web of dependencies that you need to navigate. Correct. And if you've got a really good deprecation strategy, then you can tell these consumers of your API, I'll continue to support an existing version for X amount of time. That gives them an opportunity to kind of change things as they will. And you end up with a much smoother transition to the new API instead of trying to do everything in one gut-wrenching jerk. Authentication is another kind of interesting topic, and I'm actually kind of amazed at the number of customers that I talk to that say, we really don't have any authentication in our internal APIs at all. And it's just generally interesting because not only is it a mechanism for controlling access, but it's also a good way to just track usage of different services and so on. When you've got this API tier in place, if you don't have some mechanism for tracking exactly who it is that's using your services, then you lose a little bit of the benefit of the API first architecture.
Understand.
Right?
Yeah.
So just having a good general authentication scheme that leverages API keys, even it doesn't necessarily even have to use OAuth in its full capability.
Yeah.
It could be something like API key validation or client credentials grant, a version of OAuth which doesn't require user credentials and so on. So finally, just thinking about the ways that data sharing is done across API and services is super important. As I said earlier, we've got a lot of situations with our customers where data is being returned from back-end systems in kind of its native form and being made available to applications. And in a lot of cases, that's okay. But in some cases, you're actually oversharing on data. And you may actually be taking away a certain amount of advantage that you can gain from kind of holding back a little bit on some of this data so that you can use it in your own internal applications, and at least control the way that data is being used. If you overshare, somebody picks up on the fact that you've got an interesting tidbit of information in your API, suddenly they're using this data in some way, you change something, and then you're getting calls from your developers saying, wait a minute, what did you do here? I don't understand what's happened. So it's really nice to have that level of visibility and really think about how you're using data within your internal services and your internal applications, and even for external applications as well. And the thought process that you go for this, I think, is a really integral part of the internal API program overall.
Very interesting. So to recap this, I think what I heard was, even though it's internal use cases and internal programs, think about authentication, some form of authentication, because it gives you the ability to go look at the usage, look at the data around who's using what, and that can be very beneficial. Number two is to really think about what data itself you're presenting and how do you want to control that depending on the application or internal users.
Right.
And then number three is to really think about this still as a very important contract with your developers. Just because it's internal developers does not mean that you can take them for granted, because they may be doing some very interesting and important business critical applications. So we got to think about that contract, the version control, the same way, if anything, a bit more carefully for internal users, so we don't trip them up, because they could have very impactful things going on in their sales cycle or HR systems or something else. And
Absolutely.
That's a very important part to think about.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think it's bad handling API versions and API management in mobile applications, trying to do it with business systems can be quite a challenge.
Yeah.
Quite a challenge.
So just like the last time, why don't we take a customer example now? So we talked about a lot of the internal exposure scenarios for API programs. Let's walk through an example of how one of our customers has actually put it to good use.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can see here in this case study, we have a customer that's in the news and information space, and this is again a multinational company, super powerful, in terms of their market share and so on. They've got a lot of stuff going on, really great things happening in the company. But just like a lot of companies, they've grown through acquisition, for example.
Yes.
Things have changed over time. They've reorganized and so on, and so they now have different business organizations within their company.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Each one of these has services associated with them that they're leveraging for their particular products.
Yeah.
And as they rightfully should, they're starting to think about ways that they can kind of cross-leverage a lot of these things to really gain some additional benefit from the mixture of these different services that are made available by the business units.
Yeah.
And so the API first architecture and this thinking about internal API programs and resource allocation is really super relevant in this case, because these guys are putting in place a shared infrastructure that allows them to achieve this level of sharing between different business systems. And they've got the accounting in place for resource allocation and chargeback. They've got the authentication and authorization in place. And they're able to use a lot of the scope control and resource control capabilities of the Apigee platform to manage how these things are used. And so they don't run into situations where somebody is using a new business system and suddenly the guy 2 business systems over is finding that he doesn't have the capacity to support even his applications anymore.
Sure.
Right. So this is a great example, particularly as relates to resource accounting. And it's a tremendous thing that you should be thinking of as part of an internal API program.
Okay. So given that we have about 15 minutes left and we obviously want to take some questions at the end, so let's do a quick recap in terms of what are the key takeaways in terms of internal API program.
So I think the key things that I'd like for people to kind of take away from this is, first of all, that there really is kind of a need to think a little bit beyond what we traditionally think of as the external API program and start thinking of things kind of beyond that. Look at how service-oriented architectures are being done, for example, within your organization, or how business services are exposed, and really kind of think about what that means and give it a good, solid, deep thinking, if you will, so that you clearly understand all the different implications of sharing data and the interactions between different systems and so on. The internal API program is very definitely something that can be thought of in terms of the API first architecture. Yep. And there are pieces of the internal API program that relate to both API consumption and API exposure. Yep. Definitely both perspectives, external and internal API programs, can benefit from all the capabilities that you would find in the API tier and the API first architecture. The visibility that you get from analytics for resource chargeback, as well as all the things that you would use in an internal or external program. The control and threat protection you get, it's actually kind of interesting. We have a lot of customers that talk about how they've imposed a denial of service attack on themselves.
Oh, wow.
And so, having that level of control is equally relevant regardless of whether you're an external or internal API program. This notion of shared state and managing either transient state through some of the access token mechanisms or backend as a service or whatever the case may be. And really understanding how you can leverage something like the backend as a service to bring in data from systems that are not readily accessible and still make that data available in a way that allows for that rapid level of innovation in APIs.
So before we wrap up, the other thing I wanted to ask you is that this is very pertinent to the internal API program. So one thing when I talk to a lot of customers is that this notion that if it's an internal API program, and at least from our customers' point of view, because Apigee is available both in the cloud as a public hosted cloud offering as well as on premises. Is there a best practice around when you should use on premises versus when you should use cloud?
This is a great question. And I think it has much less to do with the actual use case and a lot to do with really your organization and the nature of your organization. Some organizations, for example, are really not in the business of running a lot of infrastructure and so on, and they really want to focus on their core business, right? So, their IT organizations are pretty lean. They don't really have a lot of desire to be heavily involved in running, intensive infrastructure and so on. And so in a case like that, a managed hosting environment is terrific, because they can delegate that responsibility to Apigee. We totally handle it, and they still get all the benefits from API first and the API tier and all the things that we've talked about. Other organizations that maybe have people on staff that have more technological expertise, they're more comfortable with the operating systems and security concerns and so on, may actually be able to implement an on-premise version of Apigee and move forward with that so that they can get some of the additional visibility from an on-premise infrastructure and so on. Ultimately, it really just kind of depends on, what level of desire you have to manage that infrastructure, what kind of skill sets you have, where you really like to focus your efforts as to whether it makes sense to go on-prem or in the cloud. From our perspective as a software vendor, the software is the same either way, really. Yes. So everything that you can do with the cloud version, you can do in the on-prem version and vice versa.
Got it. So it essentially boils down to the skills, the resources you have, and if you want to manage it internally or you want to outsource that part and have somebody who can do it in a multi-tenant fashion, and you're happy with that.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So just to recap you on the takeaways, my kind of key takeaways are that one, treat the internal API program broadly the same way as you would treat it externally. And what I mean by that is that you still have to think about developers. You still have to think about how well you document your APIs, how well you share sample code and sample apps with your developers so they can get started and go and do some things very fast. Number three is to make sure that you have a contract, because your internal developers are equally important when it comes to delivering them services via APIs, so you don't want to treat them any less. So think about version control and contracts very, very carefully and thoughtfully. Number four is to really make sure that when you are providing the data internally, you are very careful about what level of data do you want to expose, because that may have implications on how people build applications, and if you deprecate something later, they may have some kind of impact there. Last but not the least, really think about even for internal use cases, whether it's business to employees or some sort of an internal application, you definitely can take advantage of backend as a service when it comes to really exposing a lot of static data or legacy data in a very mobile friendly way, for example, as one point.
Definitely true.
And then second is to really think about how do you want to integrate your internal applications for internal social networks, be it Chatter or Yammer or any of the other activities you may do within the firewall. And you can include that also as a part of the mobile backend as a service which we provide.
Yes.
So all those things put together have very similar characteristics as external API program, but in a different context.
The internal API program, yes, it's very much a different context, and you can really kind of think of it as a layer on top of the external program in some ways. You know, as you said, a lot of the characteristics are the same, but there's some additional considerations that don't apply to the external program that you really should look at when you're implementing APIs overall, regardless of how
Yes.
they're being used.
Yes.
And we've just kind of generalized those into this notion of an API program, where you can use that as a vehicle for really thinking deeply about the internal characteristics, if you will, of API usage in general in your organization.
Yes. And I'll be remiss if I don't call out the fact that, of course, even if it's an internal, even if it's for employees only, even if it's within your firewall, you do want some level of security
Absolutely
and
true.
data visibility for whatever people are using.
Absolutely true.
Okay, so great. So what we're going to do is we can switch over now and look at some of the questions we're getting. So let's start with the first one here. It's a great question, which is that most of our customers have some sort of a SOA architecture. Mm-hmm. So the question here obviously is that what value does API tier add, especially from internal API program? I know we covered some of this actually in terms of the webinar, which mm-hmm. Dilshad and Edan did, which talked about really why API program is not SOA++.
Yeah.
But I think it'll be great for our customers to listen one more time in terms of what are the kind of critical points to think about. What is the additional value of keeping an API tier when somebody already has a SOA architecture?
Well, the API tier, I guess there's a couple of different ways to think about the API tier. If you think of strictly a single data center organization, if you will, the API tier really provides you a lot of benefit in terms of visibility, in terms of consistent contract implementation. The security features are much more robust. And in fact, if you implement the API first architecture in the API tier, you can use a lot of the same facilities mm-hmm. For both the internal program and for the external program, which is not necessarily the case in other situations. Yes. So if you want to use OAuth, for example, API key validation, the same mechanisms are in place regardless of whether you're exposing APIs externally or internally. So that level of consistency is really nice from a developer standpoint. But even if you go beyond single region considerations, especially when you get into organizations that's really spread out into multiple data centers and multiple regions, parts of the world and so on, as a lot of our customers do.
Yes, absolutely.
Then we really see the benefit of the API tier, because other technologies don't necessarily allow you to spread out your processing across these different data centers. They don't have the same level of capabilities around traffic distribution and active to active disaster recovery planning, or active to passive recovery scenarios and so on. And so by implementing something like Apigee and the API tier, not only do you get all the benefits in terms of the internal API program, but you're also able to help ensure that you have a proper architecture in place so that regardless of how your company grows or how your needs evolve, you have the right level of visibility and you've got the ability to easily shift traffic in disaster scenarios and so on.
Cool. So the other question we have is a very interesting question. So if we want to take an existing system and really think about how do we build some use cases for internal APIs, what is the best place to start?
Wow, that's a really great question. The way that I would approach this would be to really start in thinking in terms of data. Mm-hmm. Okay, because to me, data kind of governs everything, if you will. You know, when you're building APIs, you're fundamentally talking about data sharing. Mm-hmm. And so really kind of understand what the usage of data is, what's appropriate to share and what's not, places where you might be able to leverage data for advantage, places where you can leverage other sources of data, such as the social stuff that we talked about with Yammer and so on. And really kind of build kind of a general picture as to how data would be used in the internal and external API programs. And then on top of that, you can really build the API contract on top of that, and a lot of the techniques that I'm sure people know in the audience that are relevant to API design, resource level design, and so on, are relevant once you've got this really clear picture of how data is being used and what kind of data you'd like to share, and so on.
Got it. But if I can add one more thing, I've at least noticed with customers that one other starting point could be, where is the maximum pressure on IT resources?
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things I've found is, if an existing architecture is starting to break at the seams because either you don't have enough resources or you're getting too many requests from different business units for exposing data in different ways because they want to do something with it, I think that gives you a fairly quick way to think about, these are some of the top 3 pain points I'm seeing from my business units, which I'm not able to address in the current architecture. So maybe the best way for me to scale and think about that is an API tier, and how do I go and start with that?
Definitely true. And having the API tier, as we've said, gives you that a great level of visibility into resource utilization, for example, so that as you are planning these new usages of data and you're trying to satisfy new use cases and so on, you can really take the API tier usage data that you get and factor that into resource planning and so on, so that you can make sure you don't run into problems down the road.
Got it. So we have another question we get this a lot of the times, which is that, hey, once you create an API tier, does that become the latency and infrastructure choke point? And we've seen this in multiple customers who have always thought about this as a choke point rather than a great scale point. So how would you respond to that question?
Well, the answer is it kind of depends.
Okay.
And we talked a little bit about the fact that you have the option to deploy either on-premise or in the cloud.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the decision points here in this is how your APIs are being used in general.
Correct.
So for example, if you're working with geographically distributed consumers or something like that, then you have to build the infrastructure in order to accommodate that, right?
Yes.
Because you're trying to optimize the user experience, minimize latency, and so on. And so in that case, you might decide to use a managed hosting environment and co-locate services and data and so on in places that allow you to optimize the user experience and minimize latency and so on. In other cases, particularly when you're using internal services, you might want to decide that bringing a system like Apigee on-premise is a good way to go.
Yep.
We've had in our experiences customers that have tried to run internal services in the cloud, and they've had a great amount of success with it. And for whatever reason, some people decide that they prefer to have the infrastructure in place so that they can scale things at their own convenience and so on, and that's totally fine from our standpoint. But really, it just kind of depends on what your use cases are, what your particular tolerance is in terms of managing infrastructure and so on. Either way, you can be successful.
And in both cases, just to re-emphasize, I don't think the API tier really becomes any kind of choke point at all when it comes to either the security aspect of it or the caching aspect of it or anything. No. If anything, it helps you scale and be more performant if you design it correctly and implement it the right way.
That's definitely true, definitely true. And the API tier also has benefits, particularly when you're implementing in the managed cloud, because you're able to, for example, do a lot of attack deflection and so on out in the cloud away from your internal network. Even if you have firewalls and so on in your network, if the attack can actually make it to your network, there's always the potential that it will have some detrimental effect to the business operation, right? So by pushing all of that stuff out and using authentication, threat protection, a lot of the capabilities that Apigee provides, you're able to push all that out and maintain that good level of experience for your internal users.
Got it. So I have a couple of questions here, which I think I can collapse into one, which is that how do we help contrast the thought process around, given there's a lot of internal systems, when I think about internal APIs, API programs, what is the construct we should think about when it comes to direct to database APIs? And how does that correlate or contrast to the mobile backend as a service, which we talked about? So how should customers think about that? Because I think a lot of customers think internal API programs, I have a bunch of databases doing something and storing some data. Should I just have direct access to them via APIs? And if I do that, then what is the role of a mobile backend as a service? Or are they completely mutually exclusive, or is there an overlap? How should we think about that?
Well, I guess the perspective that I would take is that it depends on the level of requirement you have for concurrency, for example, in the data, or currency rather, not concurrency. If you're really needing to get the most current data, then you can do it with both a backend as a service and with a database connector. if you're comfortable with kind of coding to the level of detail that you would need with a database connector with SQL statements or working with NoSQL or whatever the case may be, then you could potentially do that. But we really think that the backend as a service capability allows you to kind of abstract a lot of that technological stuff away. And you can build mechanisms that allow you to take the data, update it in the backend as a service, and mobile optimize it right off the bat. And so when mobile applications actually make requests for that data, then they're already receiving things in a mobile optimized format that's potentially been cross-referenced with location data and so on, as opposed to having to try and orchestrate all that stuff in real time in a way that takes away from the overall user experience, right? And then, of course, the backend as a service also allows you to integrate a lot of these things with push notifications and social features and so on, like activity streams and whatnot. So overall, it kind of depends on the use case, but the backend as a service really has a lot of possibilities in terms of relieving people from the technological burden of understanding databases and so on.
So to close, I think we have one last very, very pertinent question for this topic, which is that we already use some web service, and why not just stick to a direct data call or use a web service? What is the most compelling message? I think this person wants to know how to really internally sell the value of an internal API program. So what would be the three things you would say why an internal API programs make sense vis-a-vis anything they already have existing in some context?
Well, I think it fundamentally boils down to competitive advantage, first of all. By having the API program, you're able to understand and control access to data. You can build internal APIs that give your own applications a potential advantage or allow you to do things that other applications can't do, for example. This notion of really understanding visibility and being prepared for things like unexpected resource usage when new services come online and so on, I think is a really powerful aspect of the internal API program. And really just in general having a solid authentication and authorization scheme that allows you to ensure that applications that are using your backend systems are properly authorized, that they have the correct level of scope, and that really gives you strong control over what's going on and ties back to the visibility as well.
Yeah. So I think to recap, I think from my experience talking to customers, I think the important aspect is there's always pressure on IT today where they can't go and retool or invest more in the existing backend systems. But they have the pressure to go and scale. And we, I think, allow a very easy, secure way to scale things, number one. Number two, as you explained in the retail apparel example, there's a lot of data that is there which people can consume via internal APIs and build applications which can benefit the business immensely, which would take a lot more effort if you didn't have an API tier or API first architecture to get that data in a consumable form and correlate all that in a mobile app very, very fast.
Right.
And then, of course, the third one is that by exposing these things as APIs internally, I think you're also helping some internal innovation happen much faster, because now you're able to go to one central place, look at all the APIs and data that's available to you, and with the right permission and controls, you can go and build some things interesting which can impact and influence how you serve your customers better, or you can serve your employees better. And I don't think you can do that in a traditional fashion with the existing infrastructure. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think with that, I think we're just about done with the time. Thank you all for staying along and listening to this webinar. And as we said earlier, this webinar will be again posted up on our YouTube channel pretty soon. And again, we will share the slides also on SlideShare. You can always check out apigee.com and the community site at apigee.com, where you can have further questions, where all the Apigee employees will be participating, as well as some of your peers may be there to answer your questions and reflect upon this webinar and other topics. With that, I want to say thank you, and hope to see you again in some other webinar in the near future. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.